This is Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families and your window into the world of special education. Special needs parenting can be challenging, and we want to make it easier by providing you with the resources you need to help your child. Let's delve deep into the world of learning differently with your host, special education attorney Adam Dayan.
I am excited to present my next guest on the Curious Incident podcast, Dr. Jessica Meister. Jessica is a clinical neuropsychologist based in New York City, specializing in the evaluation of children, adolescents, and young adults. She established her private practice in 2017 with a mission to connect with families, provide answers, instill hope, and set her clients up for success. Jessica is known for developing strong therapeutic relationships with her clients and promoting the implementation of appropriate interventions in order to affect positive future outcomes. Jessica, thank you so much for being here with me today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Adam.
Of course. Let's jump right in. From your vantage point as a neuropsychologist, what do you see as the most urgent mental health challenges of our time as pertains to children and young adults?
This is such an important question. I think it's a huge topic on a lot of people's minds right now. But, anxiety, depression, emotional behavioral challenges are really rampant. And it's our kids, it's our teenagers, it's our parents, it's everyone. And that is just affecting, every aspect of not only kids and teens' life, but also the parents' life and how they're actually parenting their kids, and everything trickles down. So that's been a big challenge these days. Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about how? So when you say it affects so many aspects of a child's life or a parent's life, what are some examples of that?
So certainly in the way that you are parenting, the way that you are interacting with your children, your kind of expectations, your goals for them, and how those get translated will affect your child and, how they feel about themselves. And then their own, children and adolescents, their own mental health struggles, that's going to affect potentially their social relationships and engagement, their learning, their ability to even attend school. We've seen a lot of kids who have challenges with that, and just their general well-being and just their ability to become more independent, which is really our goal for them.
Talk about the way mental health impacts learning and the way learning impacts mental health.
So this is a big question, a complicated question, but there's a lot of overlap we know in terms of a lot of the most common disorders that we see and challenges that we see. So for example, in children with ADHD, we're often seeing also co-occurring anxiety or mood challenges or behavioral challenges, difficulties with self-esteem. Similarly, with children with dyslexia, we're often seeing certainly self-esteem issues, anxiety, and sometimes behavioral challenges. So this can come about in different ways, right? And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. We can't really always flesh out what came first. So in some circumstances, we see children presenting with some of these neurodevelopmental learning concerns and then later developing, potentially as a result because of the challenges, some of these emotional behavioral concerns. We also see some of these challenges in terms of the neurodevelopmental and the social emotional happening simultaneously. And on the other end, we also see children who struggle with emotional behavioral regulation. And then because of that, that will impact their learning in the classroom because they're not totally available for learning. And then they might begin to show learning challenges as a result.
I think the third one, the C example that you gave is really interesting. And I think parents sometimes overlook this one and school districts sometimes overlook this one. You're talking about a scenario where they're starting off with some sort of emotional challenge, which then develops into a learning issue. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yep. So, just as an example, if we take a child who's displaying some attentional difficulties or disruptive behavior, they're not going to be available and present for learning, even if they may have average to above average cognitive skills. They may have no, differences in terms of how they learn or think or acquire information, but because they are struggling to participate in the instruction, even just think about at a young age, just not sitting in your seat and not being able to focus on the teacher, you might be missing pockets of information that you are then not acquiring. And then that's going to then have side effects in terms of your vocabulary or your general knowledge. And then you're going to a reading comprehension and you're lacking the general knowledge that you might need to engage those comprehension skills. So that's just one example. If you're a student, let's say with anxiety that's interfering with your participation in class because of, let's say, social anxiety or performance anxiety. So now you don't want to participate, or you don't answer when the teacher is calling on you, or you're not engaging with your peers. Well, that can affect now your language development, your confidence in an academic setting, your ability to show what you know, on a test or in those performance. And then, some of your learning might be affected if you're actually not practicing those skills.
I think this gets overlooked a lot. I think school districts sometimes focus on the academics and a student's intelligence, for example, and they don't pay enough attention to the emotional, which, as you've articulated, can turn into learning and academic issues. So super important that we pay attention to the emotional side as well. I think this seems like a good place to discuss perfectionism and overachievement related to what you mentioned about anxiety. How does that fit into our conversation about mental health and learning?
So what I see in my practice, particularly in the middle school, high school level, definitely the high school level, because the stakes just are much higher. It's much more stressful. So a lot of the teenagers, if not most of the teenagers that step through my office, are presenting with some type of anxiety or depression, a lot of concerns about their grades, about their performance, about their future, about their ability to be successful. And so I'm seeing a lot of perfectionism because they're trying to control, every outcome to, ensure their own personal success. And there's just so much worry that goes into that and behind that, because I think we hear a lot in the media about how hard it is to get into school now and how difficult it is. And I think that's just become more and more intense as the years have gone on. So I'm seeing a lot of those perfectionistic behaviors, feeling like they need to be perfect. They need to do everything perfectly. They cannot fail. Failure to someone who's a perfectionist could mean even getting a B+, like that, an A-. So I'm seeing a lot of that. There's a lot of high expectations.
Certainly hitting home for me. I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, and I mean that in all seriousness. Dealt with perfectionism when I was a child. I want to delve into perfectionism further, but before I do, just talk a little bit about achieving balance. I think one thing that happens, one thing that we've talked about, is that when you're so focused on perfectionism and overachieving, that tends to take over your life. So say a few words about having balance in life.
Absolutely. Also, your comment resonated with me, as I also like to call myself a recovering perfectionist. And you never fully recover, but you are able to, maybe take it down a little bit of a few notches. And think about balance. Balance is, it's impossible, right? It's more of a goal to strive for. Maybe we don't ever fully get there, but we take tiny steps and we do what we can, because if you are solely focused on achievement and grades and where you're going next, you're not really living in the present moment. You're not really learning. You might be losing those parts of yourself that actually make you tick and thrive. And I see this in a lot of adolescents they're losing kind of their love of living in some aspect, because everything becomes about the grade and a resume and what's next, instead of, what makes you a full, well-rounded, content, fulfilled human being. And then, later on in life, what does that translate to? Being in a job that doesn't serve you, where you're not, maybe getting meaning out of that, or being in a relationship that doesn't serve you. So these early lessons in these formative and educational years, in terms of really thinking about the balance. And I'm not saying lose achievement. I'm not saying lose all of that, but just also make sure that you are integrating these other parts of you that make you thrive.
Absolutely. So achievement is important, but it's not all about achievement. So let's dive in. What is perfectionism really about in your experience, and what drives someone to be a perfectionist?
So perfectionism, like many of our personality traits, it can develop over time. Sometimes it has to do with our family of origin and, what dynamics were going on in our family of origin in terms of we felt it was an environment where maybe mistakes were not tolerated, or we couldn't make mistakes, or failure was not an option and there was a lot of pressure. And again, it could be explicitly expressed pressure, or it could just be implicit, and it just happens like in terms of the nature of situations. But usually it also comes from sort of a fear of failure, potentially low self-worth. So if I can be perfect and I can, overachieve, then I'm going to then avoid the distress or the pain that comes with failure or that comes with not being perfect. And then that would kind of reinforce this idea that, I am inferior. I really am not worth it. If I'm not perfect, if I don't do everything in this way. So it's really a coping mechanism that can be adaptive in so many ways. I don't know if this makes sense for you, but I know in my life, it absolutely helped me to get to where I am today.
Oh, yeah.
And simultaneously, there's a shadow side to that. There are certainly some areas where that personality trait has not served me, and I've had to do my own personal growth around that to not let it get the best of me in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. There's two sides to it. And I think, I've talked about my experiences with perfectionism and OCD. I don't think I would be a lawyer if I hadn't had those things. If I hadn't, wow. I don't think this is so apropos that I am fumbling for the perfect words as we're having this conversation. What I was trying to say is I don't think I would be the lawyer that I am today if not for those things. And I probably wouldn't be practicing in the area of law that I practice in if not for those things. And so definitely some positives there. But I think what you're saying is that we also need to learn to manage the negatives.
Absolutely.
Okay. So when we were talking in preparation for this episode, you mentioned so many insightful things that parents can do with their children to make sure they're reinforcing the right areas. Can you speak more about that?
Absolutely. So, of course, we want to encourage kids to do well. And we will naturally, as parents, as educators, other adults in a child's life, of course, when they do something well or they achieve, like we're going to reinforce those things, and that feels good, right? That feels good to kids to hear that. But we really want to be careful about how much we are focusing on the outcome, the product, rather than focusing on reinforcing the process, right? The persistence, what it took to get there, what emotions you had to tolerate, what distress, what struggle you had to manage to get to where you are. So less about the grades and the achievement and what school you got into, but, how did you get there? And what were the behaviors that got you to that place? Because that's really, I think, what's important in terms of our parenting. It's not to have kids avoid struggle and avoid all pain and avoid anxiety and avoid all negative emotions. Those are all a part of the human experience. It's to help them to have the confidence and the ability to push through all of those struggles and negative experiences, and to know that they can still do that and manage all of that in the face of the anxiety and the fear.
Yeah, this comes up in my household a lot, reinforcing the process rather than the outcome. And my wife is in education and has been a teacher in the past, and it takes practice, I have to say, to focus on what the process was. What qualities did they demonstrate to complete that project? And if you're not praising the finished result, what creativity did they demonstrate during that process? Or what obstacles did they overcome to exhibit perseverance, grit, all of the qualities to keep going in the face of adversity that serve us so well in life, right?
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better, Adam.
You did say it better. I was just complimenting. And the other thing we talked about was accepting that everybody makes mistakes and modeling for your kids exactly that we make mistakes and that we can talk about them or learn from them. Do you want to speak a little bit more on that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as kids are growing up, they sort of idealize their parents. They're these not godlike, but, they don't make mistakes. They're perfect. They know exactly what we're doing. We learn later through adolescence and adulthood that is certainly not the case. And I think the earlier that you can model and show your children that you are in fact not perfect, that mistakes are a part of life, they are a part of the learning, the human experience and the learning experience. It's how we learn, how we grow, how we figure out what we like, what we don't like, what we could do differently next time. The more you can model that and express that, and I know I like to come off as I don't make any mistakes. And that's just not the reality. And we want our children to feel comfortable also coming to us when they have made a mistake, or coming to us when they are experiencing something and they want to be, validated in that experience. And so we have to be able to tolerate that we are making mistakes within ourselves, our partner's mistakes, certainly, all of our relationships with our family members, that none of us are perfect. And also modeling for our kids, our inner dialogue around a situation that's, of course, developmentally appropriate to share, but that maybe you struggled with in a small way. How did you talk through that in your head? What's the self-talk that the pep talk you gave yourself to get through versus putting yourself down, or, reacting strongly when you do make an error. I mean, I have this one memory of childhood of, I don't remember who dropped it, but someone dropped a jar of marinara sauce and it just red everywhere. And I just remember it being sort of a catastrophe, and it doesn't have to be. So your reaction is also really important. Or if you do have a big reaction, because again, we're human, coming to them and saying, hey, you know what? This actually wasn't that big of a deal. Like, these things happen. It's okay. And we move forward. Like, what are we going to do next?
Yeah. So I definitely want to get into your therapeutic approach to neuropsychological assessments. But before I do, is there anything else on this subject of perfectionism or recommendations that you have for families that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think especially if you do have a child who is, bright, who a lot of things do come easily to them, we need to make sure we're also giving them opportunities to struggle, and to have a little bit of a challenge, and to develop that grit, and to really teach them and model that, like, it is okay if this is not going exactly how we planned, or this is a little bit difficult. I see this a lot in kids with sort of twice exceptionality, because, they're so bright and so many things come easy to them. And then they have this one area where it's just like, they can't learn to read, or they really can't attend. And so that just becomes a huge issue because of that discrepancy. And so as a parent, just really from an early age, talking about that we all have unique strengths and challenges. And we'll get into this, I think, a little bit later when we talk about the therapeutic assessment process that I use, but talking to them about what are your strengths, what are your areas of challenge that you're working on, and that it's okay to have those. Everyone has all of the above.
That's well said. And since you mentioned twice exceptionality, I'll just say that by the time this episode comes out, we'll have released an episode on twice exceptionality as well. So feel free to check that out. So Jessica, you take a therapeutic approach to neuropsychological assessments. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So I think in the past, sometimes neuropsychologists get a bad rap. People think you come into our office, we administer these tests, you leave with a report, and we're done. But that's, so not the case. We're not robots. Luckily, AI cannot replace us, which is a great thing. And this is a therapeutic process. This is not just you go in for a blood test and then you leave. And that's why we're trained as psychologists first and then neuropsychologists second, because we are going through a journey with families, with parents, with schools, with other caregivers, with other professionals, and with the kids and teens that we work with and young adults that we work with. So, the relationship building of this is extremely important. We have to build an alliance. We have to gain trust. We have to, validate what families are going through. They're a lot of times coming to us feeling pretty helpless or hopeless about their situation, or blaming themselves or blaming their child. And they don't know what to do. And we have to be there along with that therapeutic journey and that ride to help create the path and to be with them at every point.
I've heard you describe your role as part science, part art. Do you want to talk about the part that's art?
Sure. So of course, we've got statistics in neuropsychology, we've got the science, we have the evidence-based intervention and assessments, but the therapy of the assessment process is the art. It's where we have to really connect. We have to really build rapport. This process could be smooth. It could be rocky. It could be shame or guilt inducing. It could be challenging. It could be validating. It could be all of these things. And again, we have to meet the families where they are in their process, what emotions they're experiencing around this, and trying to gain a better understanding of that so that we can also deliver feedback in a way that they can hear us and that they can feel hopeful, and that they're not just going to, take my plan and then or throw my report in the garbage, hopefully. They're really going to say, okay, like this makes sense. My evaluator understands me. They get my child and they know what to do next, and I'm going to go ahead and follow through. But if we're not focusing on the art of that communication, relationship building, and delivery and guidance, that process is not going to be as effective.
So in a therapeutic assessment model like yours, what role does the child play in the evaluation process?
So this starts from the moment that the parent shares that their child is being evaluated. Sometimes I try to give guidance on how parents should share this process, and ideally not using the terms evaluation or testing, especially if they're super young, just not to induce extra anxiety, but really a journey. And my mission is to help kids to understand what their strengths are, what areas they might be a little bit tricky for them or they're having challenges with, and what can we do to help, and how can your teachers and your parents help you? And so ideally parents will use some of my terms to do this. I always tell them, you can say I'm Dr. Jess, but I don't give any shots. I know I hated shots as a kid. I really didn't like going to the doctor. So sometimes I even take out that doctor label. It doesn't really matter. Call me Jessica. As formal or informal as necessary to help the child to feel comfortable and to be a part of this process, and not just getting dropped off at an appointment and it's like, what am I doing here? So we have to also engage kids the first session, like, why do you think you're here? What did mom and dad tell you? And then I will kind of reiterate my spiel and, try to engage them early on of like, what questions do you have about your brain, or what would you like to learn? Or what do you think you're really good at? What's tricky for you?
I love the metaphor you use in this context, highways and roads. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So this model of therapeutic assessment, I want to give so much kudos to Dr. Liz Angoff, who really developed this, and it's brilliant. I wish I had come up with all of it myself, but I really integrate her model a lot. She has a brain building book and explainingbrains.com. There's resources for parents and professionals on there, which are absolutely wonderful. But, in the book and the way that I talk to kids about this is that teaching them, the lobes of the brain, what each area of the lobe is responsible for, talking about neurons, how messages are communicated, and helping them to understand that basically it's almost like we have all of these tiny roads in our brain that we're building, and talking to kids about, okay, like what were the things that you didn't used to be able to know how to do, but then you built these roads in your brain, right? You didn't know how to talk. You didn't know how to walk. You didn't know how to ride a bike, right? Helping them to come up with their own ideas of these things, not just us kind of telling them. And then thinking about, there are a lot of roads that are already built, or, highways where we can go super fast. That means like that comes naturally to us, no problem. But then these other roads that are still under construction, we're still working on them. We can add the bridge, and in order to do that, we have to, we'll put in the work and the effort. Our brains are plastic. I talked to them about neuroplasticity, and that, we can continue to grow and create more new roads and work on those roads under construction with the help of construction tools and a construction team.
So I was just going to say, some people like to avoid roads under construction and stick to the highways. They like to do the things they're already good at and avoid things that may appear challenging. So how do you approach that in conversation with the people you work with?
Well, that's certainly something that I used to do. in many ways because, as a perfectionist, right, you don't want to fail. So you want to be in situations where you know that you could potentially succeed, or that you have as much certainty as one possibly can to know that you would succeed. And what happens is that, I think we all know that life happens. Roads under construction will happen whether we want them to or not. And we don't always have that kind of certainty and control, even though we'd like to. And so we have to help kids to be in those situations, to practice. Because, as someone, even in my life, I find that later on in my adulthood, when I did come to that road that was really tricky, it hit me very hard emotionally because I had never experienced that, maybe type of struggle or failure before. And so if we can help kids from an earlier age in small ways, I'm not saying huge amounts of adversity, I'm just saying little things along the way, that working through these roads under construction is part of life. It's part of our process. And if that's normalized for kids, I think that will go a lot better as they age and as things happen.
Right. And by the time they become adults, they'll be so used to adversity in small doses, it'll just be a natural aspect of life.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else that sets you apart from other neuropsychologists in terms of your skills or expertise?
Speaking of my highways and roads under construction, I think for me, my highways truly are building relationships, getting to know people really well, and getting the full picture of the individual and the family that I'm working with and the context and culture that they're living in, because that's such a big part of the process. And in my communication, really the art of what I do. And so luckily, those are some of my highways, and I'm able to really utilize those in my practice. The other piece of my practice, again, and this comes from my initial training as a psychologist, is really making this process as therapeutic as possible. So not only in the art of what I do, but also in implementing the behavioral interventions that you need in a session to try to get the best data and information that you can, and to establish the best relationship. I want kids to feel comfortable, safe to take risks. I really want to see what they can do in this environment. And so if I have a child who's displaying disruptive behavior, I have the experience from my training in doing treatment with those, treatment for those challenges and working with parents to actually integrate those behavioral interventions straight into the testing situation. So for example, a lot of the strategies from, let's say, PCIT in terms of child-directed interaction skills, helping with setting up reward systems and behavior plans, and using praise, using active ignoring at times, setting up a lot of structure and predictability, especially if kids are anxious or have difficulty with those transitions, letting them know exactly what to expect, giving them choices. I talk to a lot of my colleagues who do ABA, some of the things that they use for students in terms of timers, giving breaks. I always joke with choices, right? With kids, you want a 3-minute break or a 5-minute break. So they feel like they have agency in that break, even though I'm setting it up for them. And then similarly with kids with anxiety, even to the level of severity of selective mutism, where they actually have so much anxiety where they're unable to really speak, and that really affects their performance in school. And so in the evaluation, I want to get a really sense of where are their verbal and language skills. And in order to do that, I actually have to use these therapeutic strategies that I used to use in treatment for children with selective mutism and severe social anxiety to get them to be able to verbalize to me so that I can get an accurate sense of where they are in terms of their cognitive functioning, language functioning, and academic functioning.
You mentioned PCIT. Do you want to clarify what that is?
Sure. So PCIT stands for Parent-Child Interaction Training. It was initially developed to work with kids with disruptive behavior, kids with ADHD. It's now been transformed to use with kids who may have autism, may have experienced trauma, have selective mutism or severe anxiety. But essentially, it really helps to build the parent-child relationship, or in my case, the clinician-child relationship, and also to be able to set effective limits and to help your child with their emotion regulation skills.
How can a neuropsych evaluation help tease apart emotional symptoms or executive functioning challenges a child may be presenting with? So
it's tricky business teasing all of this apart. And the reality is, I think we think of these things as so separate, but they're really so integrated. We have one brain. So whether it's a mental health concern or a cognitive concern, they're sort of all tied together. We have students that I see in my practice who have, neurodevelopmental executive functioning challenges, meaning these are things that they have had, their whole life and that present in different ways over time. But this is sort of a part of how their brain is developed and is maturing. And then on the other hand, in terms of anxiety, depression, OCD, trauma, those, emotional challenges and psychological conditions can have a big impact on your executive functioning, because the part of the brain where we have emotions, which is called the amygdala, it can actually affect the frontal lobes and other areas of the brain that are responsible for helping us to concentrate, to focus our attention, to initiate tasks, to plan and organize ourselves. So I like to call it an amygdala hijack, right? So it's sort of hijacking the rest of our brain. So even if I have the skills, like I'm actually very organized and planful, and I know how to problem solve, and I don't have a neurodevelopmental attention issue, we know that concentration problems are one of the main symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. So that's what's happening in an amygdala hijack. And so if let's say you have severe test anxiety and you're in a test, you might have trouble with recall. You might have trouble concentrating. You might not be problem solving efficiently because maybe you misread the problem. And that's not because you don't know how to do it. That's not because you haven't learned it. It's not because you don't have the skill, but it's because you can't perform in that moment because of the emotional challenges that you're having. So within our neuropsych assessment process, which tends to be pretty comprehensive, we are really doing a deep dive into what are the emotional challenges we're seeing? What are the executive functioning challenges that we're seeing? How long have they been happening for? Did something precipitate them? Have they changed over time? This is why you can't just go to, a pediatrician's office and just fill out a rating scale and say, oh, like you have XYZ challenge or executive function differently. We need to do a deep dive to see if this is one or both of these things.
That resonates very strongly. I mean, I've been there where your brain is just preoccupied when you're a kid in the classroom because you're feeling anxious about something that's going on in school or in your social life. And then you come out of a lesson and you just realize, wow, I got so little from that lesson. Where was my brain? And I think that's what happens when you're dysregulated and you can't receive information. And I think this ties into what you were saying earlier about the shadow side of certain issues, right? There's an adaptive side which can benefit you. And there's also the side that needs managing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you help your students manage the issues that you identify, right? You uncover what they are in the evaluation process. I know you don't like to refer to it as the evaluation process, at least when you're talking to the kids. And then you make recommendations for what they can do to manage those issues and achieve academic, emotional, social, and behavioral success, correct?
Correct.
Talk about this concept of performance deficit versus skills deficit.
So I was starting to touch on this before a few times when we were speaking, but basically in a performance deficit, we're talking about when the individual, they possess the skills, they have learned the skills, they have developed it, they have the ability to do something. But when it comes to the moment of performance, they're not able to show what they know, perform up to their potential, or, their mind goes blank and they're not able to focus and follow through. That's usually due to some type of emotional or behavioral or psychological factor that they can't perform a task up to their potential. So, for example, I was speaking about the student with severe anxiety earlier, where they're actually so severely anxious that they're not able to speak in school to their teachers or to their peers. But at home, they're fully verbal, in the comfort of their home with particular people in a particular certain situation. They have the receptive expressive language skills. They have the social communication skills. They're not actually struggling with those skills, but they can't perform it in that situation because of the anxiety. On the flip side of that, we have students who have skills deficit. So what that means is that they haven't yet developed the skill to be able to perform. And so, for example, in a child who has dyslexia, they may be struggling with their phonological awareness and phonological processing. And as a result, they haven't yet developed the decoding skills to comprehend a text because they're not actually able to engage in the appropriate word reading to know what they're reading to be able to comprehend.
All right. Do you want to talk a little bit about how these relate to each other or how one can turn into the other?
Sure. So in terms of the skills deficit, and in the example I gave before, this is something I commonly see in my office with students with dyslexia. They can tell early on that there is something different about the way that they are learning, and they're seeing other kids around them. And it's only natural human experience to feel, what's wrong with me? Or, this might not be totally conscious and explicit because they're often itty bitty, but there's something different about what I'm doing, and other kids seem to have an easier time than me. And so that's where we see some of the self-esteem issues start to arise, some of the performance anxiety. So now they're avoiding reading in front of other people in the classroom, skip my turn. And, sometimes as parents and as educators and professionals, we also don't want them to be in distress. So we'll naturally, sort of enable that situation to happen, and maybe they're not getting the practice. So that's where a skills deficit, they were lacking the skills, and now that's turning into a performance issue as well. And the two become tied together. So, and then even if they do learn more of those skills, they might still feel less confident and less able to perform in certain situations.
There's been a significant rise in anxiety and depression in children and teenagers. To what do you attribute this?
So this is a big question. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do have my thoughts and hypotheses also based on, what we're seeing in the research and what I'm seeing in my office. So, I don't want to be a broken record, but clearly the COVID-19 pandemic was such a huge event in our lives. And what I see with a lot of teenagers and young adults now is that when that hit, there were it was a huge group of things that were all happening at the same time for a lot of these, especially middle schoolers or students entering, let's say, kindergarten for the first time. So, but on the middle school, age level, right, they're starting to go through puberty. They're transitioning to middle school. The expectations are harder. They need to be more independent. The social pressures, become more intense. And all of that is typical. That's all a part of being, in that phase of life. But then on top of it, we had the pandemic, the anxiety of that, the social isolation, the remote school. There were just so many stressors and pressures coming all at once. And that's having a huge effect on our teens now because so much was happening in a really important time frame. And that has affected them in a really big way.
Yeah, and you mentioned social pressures. Those aren't new, but social media is kind of new. That didn't exist when I was a kid. Maybe it didn't when you were a kid, but do you want to talk a little bit about social media?
Yeah, we definitely need to talk about social media for better or for worse. It is now, a big part of all of our lives, and we know that it is contributing to mental health challenges in a lot of kids, teens, and adults. There's a lot of self-diagnosis happening, and again, this is a blessing and a curse that we have all of this access to information, people trying to reduce stigma around, mental health and neurodevelopmental challenges and wanting to promote neurodiversity. And that is a great thing. And we have to move the needle to a certain extent. But on the flip side of that, it can go too far. And then, a lot of kids are over pathologizing themselves, teenagers and adults, mostly, coming in asking like, do I have ADHD? Do I have autism? And look, in some cases, yes, there are cases where things are undiagnosed. And in other cases, I think we are all over pathologizing kind of normative experiences that happen in life and especially through development. And we just really have to be careful about that because the more attuned we become, I think, to all of these challenges, that can end up hurting us in the end.
What's an example of over pathologizing?
So, I think, for example, like it's typical to have some anxiety and some social pressure as you're going through your adolescent years and, with friends. And there are kids coming in to see me and they're saying like, I have rejection sensitivity. When something happens in a social situation, they get rejected, or maybe in a dating situation. It's like, no, like feeling rejected is bad. Like it doesn't feel good. None of us, do well with that. And so again, some of these kids and teens really do have significant mental health struggles, and we want to make sure that we are addressing those and identifying those. But sometimes these are just these normal struggles of life that we have to support our kids as parents and educators and other professionals in kind of managing and working through.
And we don't have to strive to get rid of those feelings, right? It's okay to feel bad. It's okay to feel sad. Part of the human experience is feeling those emotions, yes?
Exactly. And I think it's only natural as parents. We don't want kids to suffer. We don't want kids to feel pain. And the reality is, though, that is a part of the human experience. It's okay to have those, negative feelings and experiences. And that's also, what helps us. This is so silly, but the movie Inside Out, and they basically talk about like there is no joy without sadness. So those are all a part of the human experience, and it's really important.
Love that movie. My kids love that movie too. There's another one coming out.
I heard, and I think they're delving into some of the more nuanced emotions. I'm really excited to see it.
Nice. Me too. I'm starting a movement to get rid of smartphones. Do you want to join me?
That's a tough one, Adam. I don't know if I can get rid of smartphones, but I do think again, going back to the idea of balance and middle path, I'm like a broken record with these two words, these two phrases, but we really do need to be careful in terms of how much we're on there. I mean, it's distracting. It helps us to sometimes avoid boredom, avoid anxiety, avoid sadness. And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, some of the times where I was feeling the most bored, that's where creativity comes, right?
Oh my God. This is a thing in my house. And my kids will say, I'm bored. And I say, great, you're about to do something really creative. And they really took to that. And they say it now before I say it. And I think they're starting to embrace it. It's so true. You're feeling bored, and then the next thing you know, you're doing something new that you figured out or came up with or created or collaborated on, and it's a blessing.
It's absolutely a blessing, and we need to give kids the time to be bored and the time to just sit, and to also make sure they're not avoiding negative feelings that we have, which again, it's only natural as humans. Like we try to avoid pain, but it is important to acknowledge and observe, from a mindfulness perspective, like what am I feeling, and not judge it necessarily.
All about mindfulness. I'm into meditation, the whole thing. I love what you're saying. Talk about the dopamine factor.
So, we know we have these neurotransmitters in the brain. One is dopamine. They get triggered and firing for many different reasons, but certainly, like we know, certain drugs will, trigger certain neurotransmitters in our brain. And so when we are on technology, when we are getting this immediate gratification, and it's exciting, and there's lights and there's graphics, and we're swiping, and we're getting all these dopamine hits, and it's almost making us addicted to it. And when I see children also with ADHD, they're especially susceptible to that, because that's something they're really looking for, but really it can affect anyone. And so it's important that we're not constantly just seeking out that feeling. Like sometimes we just need to be how we are. We're sitting in stillness. We're sad. We're being quiet. We're just being content. And it's also not the goal to be joyful and ecstatic 24 hours a day.
I did it briefly yesterday. It was such a beautiful day. The sun was shining. It was like 60 something degrees. It was very hectic in the office. I went for a quick lunch, and before going back in, I just looked outside, stayed present, appreciated the sunlight, and it was rejuvenating. It was, as brief as it was really rejuvenating.
I feel the exact same way, and I purposefully walked home because of that.
Nice. What role does test taking and parental pressure play in this increase in anxiety, depression, and related mood disorders?
I think the pressure around test taking has been around for a long time. And it's worried me because the purpose of school is to educate, not to do well on tests. But obviously we also need to assess how kids are doing. And these are ways that we are figuring out, where kids are going to go next. I mean, I use tests obviously in my work, every day, but again, I don't like to call them tests, but certainly with high stakes testing in terms of college, with COVID and then just some other trends, we've seen them remove test requirements, put test requirements back. The whole situation is actually stressful just because of that. And then if students have the choice, do I take the SAT? Do I not take the SAT? And now there's all these extra decisions around there just to add to all of the stress and pressure of just being a later adolescent and trying to figure out what you're going to do next in your life. So I think that pressure is really intense, and some students just aren't that great of test takers, or they have these performance deficits or these anxiety challenges that can really get in the way, and it's just not reflective of who they are as a learner or just as a whole person. Mm-hmm. So that's really important to keep in mind. And again, some of this anxiety is normal, but now you can go on TikTok or go on Instagram and see who's getting into what college and what they scored on what. And, we weren't seeing that in my day. I sound so aging myself, but now you can watch online and there's even more negative comparisons that can happen.
Yeah. So I know for me personally, mindfulness has been very helpful. Managing my own issues over the decades has been very helpful. The stuff I dealt with as a child is not an issue for me these days. Talk about the role of a parent in being mindful of their own anxiety and how that affects or should affect their interactions with their kid.
This is a huge topic, and I think probably one of the most important things that we can do for kids right now, and probably always. As adults, we all have things that we've struggled with. Sometimes we've addressed them, sometimes we haven't addressed them. Anxiety is also ubiquitous as a parent. I mean, of course, you're going to worry about your kid's health, your kid's safety, your kid's ability to be successful. And I think it's important to validate and acknowledge that that's normal. Like, that is a part of, I think, the parental experience. Now, the next part is, what do you do with that, right? Because the way that you manage what's going on for you as a parent and as a caregiver and as a teacher is going to affect the kids and teens that you're interacting with. So it is totally okay to be worried about your child's future and their success. But I really want to encourage parents and teachers and caregivers to be mindful about how that might be impacting their interaction with their kid, how they're talking to their child, just their behaviors toward their child, because I think that awareness is the key. And of course, we're going to have, certain moments and certain things. And again, this is a balance of just like not all the time and, or just noticing it and expressing that to your child so that you're acknowledging like, hey, I think I came down on you a little bit hard about, this test grade, or, really wanting to feel like maybe I'm trying to change who you are. And I don't want that. I want you to be the best you, and just being more mindful, being more observant of what you are feeling as a parent. Number one, it will help you to model and teach that to your kid, which I think should be a huge goal for all parents. And number two, it'll really help with your connection and your relationship with your child, and then your child's ability to move through life.
Well said. How do you advise parents to think about the role of extracurricular activities in their child's growth and development?
So this is also a big topic, but I believe that extracurriculars are so important for a variety of reasons. If your child has any type, certainly of neurodevelopmental or learning challenge or mental health challenge, I mean, this is an opportunity for them to do something that they enjoy, that they can feel a sense of self-mastery doing. It can really encourage areas of strength and talent. And we really need to balance against whatever other challenges that they're having. And it will also help them to cope with those challenges. I mean, I know for me, I grew up dancing, and if I didn't have dance, I don't know where I would be, because it was really the way that I was able to manage my anxiety and learn so many coping skills and executive functioning skills and time management skills. We also know that in the case of regular cardiovascular exercise, that's one of the best things that we can all do for our cognitive and emotional health. So when parents come to me and say, oh, they're really behind in reading, they need to do tutoring every single day, they're also getting it in school, we're setting up the IEP. I'm like, okay, hold on, take a deep breath. We do not want to pull kids out of their opportunities for extracurricular enjoyed activities, for exercise, and for socialization outside of the context of school. It's really important, again, to think about that balance. It's not to say that they don't need extra tutoring or remediation, but we cannot remove those other things that are going to make them thrive and also really help them with their mental health and their cognitive health.
Right, because if you have that place that you can go to where you're happy and you do well and you're interacting with other peers, whether it's dance or sports or arts and crafts, whatever it may be. My daughter loves gymnastics. That helps you build that confidence, and it's something that you're looking forward to. And any adversity that you may be experiencing in the classroom or the school setting, or perhaps socially outside of this loved activity, it helps you to cope, as you said, with those challenges, correct?
Absolutely. And the other piece is that ideally, the extracurricular activity, whatever that is, going to be different for every kiddo, but ideally that's something that they choose, that they want. And we want to build that intrinsic motivation for them to set a goal and then do the hard work and figure out what it takes to achieve that goal. And so when that comes from them and not you, it's so much more motivating and rewarding for them. And then they can learn how to do that for the future.
Absolutely. Talk about what you see in your practice in terms of parents who push their children into situations that may not be the best for them.
So this is mostly not done purposefully, right? This is sometimes just what happens when we're not always mindful of what might be best for a child. And kids may end up suffering silently or not so silently, and they may really push back at parents and become quite oppositional when they're pushed into situations that aren't a good fit for them. So you know your child best. And you can also take into consideration the perspectives of other helping adults, and just think about that, everyone has a good perspective on your child, and it's important to take all of that into consideration and really think about, okay, I really had my mind on this school for my child and this plan, and it was all mapped out. And sometimes we have to be flexible and we have to change the plan if your child is struggling and they're not thriving in that setting. So this comes up a lot in my practice with thinking about schools. And when the parent makes the decision to keep their child in a situation that's really not mentally or physically healthy for them, that can really lead to a lot of more mental health problems down the road.
We may have touched on this a little bit before. Parenting is a hard job. What advice do you have to parents about the values they should try instilling in their children, specifically where they should be pushing versus easing off?
So again, this is really personal, right? Values are personal. We all come from different families and different set of circumstances, different culture, different situations. So you really need to think about what your values are in terms of who you are and as a parent and what you want to instill in your kid. That being said, I spent a lot of time, reading and working on my own values and thinking about, what I want to impart to the people that I work with. And it's really important to think about, in my perspective, what brings meaning, what brings peace, and what brings joy. And that doesn't mean that we're joyful all the time. But meaning is really the big one here. And I don't know if anyone has read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, but it's a really excellent read. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how," right? So finding your why, finding your meaning, finding what fulfills you, I think that is one of the most important things to try to instill in your child so that they can feel content in their life and to feel like they're doing something meaningful and they're able to make it through the challenging experiences of this life. So I think that's huge.
I love your values. I have given some thought to my values as well. They're different words, but I think they mean the same exact thing as yours. Love, faith, gratitude.
I love that.
And when kids are coming up with, you just talked about parents coming up with the values for their family. Is a child meant to be part of that process? Or meant to come up with their own values, or what? Talk about that aspect.
That's a tricky one, but I think, as parents, of course, when your child is young, like you want to kind of start to not just talking to them about their values, but also like living by those values. And, kids, monkey see, monkey do, right? So even if you're saying one thing, but you're doing another thing, like if I'm sitting here saying that my value is balance and I need to take care of myself and make sure I'm saying no to things that don't serve me, but I'm then taking on all these extra responsibilities and then finding myself exhausted and finding myself, run to the ground, and my child's watching that, that's the message that they're going to take in. So, I think as a parent, you have to live by your own values. And then as a family, I think it's a great exercise when kids are young and then as they're getting older to talk about like, okay, what are the expectations in our family? What are the values in our family? What do we want to reinforce and support in each other? I think it's important for them to become a part of the process. And ultimately, as a parent, accepting that also your child is an individual. They are different from you, and all of your children might be different from each other. And not everybody's going to have the same path or the same values.
What do you tell your clients about how they can talk to their children about their children's learning differences?
So this is just another part of that therapeutic assessment process, because, in an ideal world, I do feedback with the parents. I will also do feedback with a child, but this is not a one-time conversation. This is going to be a potentially lifelong conversation, and it's going to look different at different stages of your child's development. It's really important to involve your child in the process. They're going to be like, why am I going to this funny lady's office? Like, what am I doing here with answering all of these questions? So, of course, in a developmentally appropriate way, we need to engage them and help them understand what they're doing here and, give them some answers. So a lot of parents don't want to, increase stigma. They don't want to label. And I understand that. And I do work with parents on those values and figuring out how we can navigate that and still give the child some feedback. And maybe later on they end up sharing. But I'm a big proponent of sharing this information with kids so that they're not coming up with their own attributions as to why, they can't read. I'm stupid. I'm dumb, right? Those are some of the most common ones, like I can't do it. Mm-hmm. So we want to help kids to understand what their strengths are, and then what their challenges are so that they can advocate for themselves, so they can feel empowered, so they can feel less isolated. So it's really important to talk to your kids about learning differences, and it's not a one-time conversation in my office. It's an ongoing one. One of the most important things as a parent is to manage your own emotions around this before you go into those conversations, because if you go in that, this is really negative or you're really anxious, that's going to, get translated into how your child takes that conversation. But, I have conversations with 7-8-year-olds and their parents now, and the kid's like, okay, because we have certain connotations around these diagnostic labels that the kids don't have. They don't have to have them. Right. So the way that we talk about them and frame them is really important. And the reality is that most of these kids have really cool brains. Like, there are really cool things that their brains can do, and neurodiversity is amazing, and it's what makes all of us unique and interesting. And so I try to go in with that mindset with the feedback.
What else do you want our listeners to know?
I think that we've been talking about these themes throughout, but first, I just want to say that I just want everyone to know it's okay to struggle. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to fail. It's okay to fall 7 times and stand up 8 and to make mistakes. We have to tolerate that in ourselves, in our partners, in our children. And that's really how we build those resilience muscles. And on top of that, because often parents are coming to me needing help and guidance and direction. What do I pick? And do we go to this school? Do we choose this school? Do they do tutoring or remediation twice a week? Or do we put them in therapy? And I just want everyone to know that there's no one right path. We only have choices. So we have to figure out how to tolerate the uncertainty of knowing that we may or may not have made the right choice, and also have the confidence to know that we can change course if something's not working out.
And that's very encouraging. There's no right way. You choose, and if you make a mistake, you course correct and fix it.
Exactly.
Jessica, where can our listeners find out more information about you?
The best way to find out more information is to head to my website, meisterpsychology.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at dr.jessicameister.
Jessica, thank you so much for being a guest on our show today. I'm so impressed by your therapeutic approach to helping children understand themselves better so they can implement effective strategies to learn and grow. It's been wonderful getting to know you over the last few years, and I look forward to being in touch in the future.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for listening to Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families. Don't forget to subscribe for a new episode every month. For more resources and helpful information, check out our website and blog at dayanlawfirm.com. This podcast provides general information which is not intended to and does not constitute legal advice. You should not rely on this information for any purpose. For legal counsel, you should consult with an attorney to discuss your specific circumstances. Your listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC. No attorney-client relationship is established unless a retainer agreement has been executed between the client and the law offices of Adam Dayan. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any guests featured or resources mentioned on this podcast are for information purposes and are not endorsed by the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC.